They say a man knows when death has marked the room. But what happens when a performer, mid-song, mid-verse, in front of 3,000 people, sees something so disturbing he stops the band cold? Mobile, Alabama. January 1970. Johnny Cash froze. Not because of a heckler. Not because of technical failure. Because of a symbol. A strange, silent image held up in the crowd. And whatever it meant, it shook him so hard he couldn't continue. The question nobody asks is this: why did no one ever mention it again? Mobile in 1970 was not a peaceful place. The South was still digesting the Civil Rights Act, still nursing wounds from integration battles that left scars on school steps and lunch counters. Alabama specifically had become a kind of spiritual ground zero for American transformation, and not everyone welcomed it. George Wallace still held enormous sway. The Klan, though weakened, had not disappeared. It had gone quieter, more coded, more symbolic. In certain counties, you could still find men who communicated not with words but with images, gestures, handshakes, markings. And Mobile sat right on the edge of all that tension, a port city with old money, old families, old grudges. It was also a city that loved music. Country, gospel, blues, they all lived there together, sometimes uneasily. When Johnny Cash came to town, it meant something. He wasn't just an entertainer. He was a preacher without a pulpit, a prophet without a denomination. People came to see him not just to hear songs but to feel something larger than themselves, something that reminded them they were still alive in a world that kept trying to bury them. The show that night was held at the Mobile Municipal Auditorium, a mid-century structure that had seen everything from boxing matches to beauty pageants. The building had decent acoustics and could hold a sizable crowd, though it wasn't known for comfort. Wooden seats, narrow aisles, a stage that wasn't particularly elevated. It was the kind of venue where you felt close to the performer, whether you wanted to or not. Cash had been touring hard that winter, moving through the South like a man on a mission. He was riding high on the success of his recent prison albums, and his TV variety show had turned him into a household name. But fame had also made him a target. There were people who despised what he stood for, his support for Native American rights, his willingness to sing for inmates, his refusal to align cleanly with any political faction. To some, he was a hero. To others, a traitor to the old Southern way. And in a place like Mobile, those battle lines were drawn in invisible ink, only readable when the light hit just right. The setlist that night followed his usual pattern. He opened strong, probably with Folsom Prison Blues, or I Walk the Line, something to get the crowd on their feet. June Carter was with him, as she often was, and the Tennessee Three provided the backbone. Marshall Grant on bass, Luther Perkins' widow had been replaced by Bob Wooten on guitar, W.S. Holland on drums. The band was tight. Cash's voice was in good form, that deep baritone rolling out over the crowd like distant thunder. Everything was going as planned. Then, midway through the set, something changed. Accounts vary on exactly which song he was performing. Some say it was during Ring of Fire. Others recall it being a gospel number, possibly. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? What everyone agrees on is this: Johnny Cash saw something in the audience, and his face went white. He stopped singing. The band kept playing for a few beats, then faltered, then quit. The silence that followed was the kind that makes people uncomfortable, the kind where you can hear coats rustling and someone coughing 3 rows back. Cash stood at the microphone, staring into the crowd. His hand came up slowly, pointing toward a section on the left side of the auditorium, maybe 10 rows back. People turned to look. Some stood up. The house lights were dim, so it was hard to see clearly, but those closest to the area reported that a man, middle-aged, unremarkable, was holding up a piece of cardboard, hand-drawn, crude but deliberate. On it was a symbol. Not a word. Not a slogan. A symbol. And whatever it was, it hit Johnny Cash like a fist to the chest. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, breathing, staring. The crowd began to murmur. Some thought he was sick. Others thought it was part of the show, some kind of planned moment. But those who knew Cash, who had seen him perform dozens of times, recognized the look. It wasn't stagecraft. It was real fear, or real anger, or something close to both. June Carter stepped forward, touched his arm, said something no one else could hear. He shook his head slowly, then leaned into the microphone and said, very quietly, "We're going to take a short break." Then he walked off stage. The band followed. The crowd sat in confusion. The man with the sign disappeared into the crowd, and no one stopped him. What happened backstage is mostly speculation. There are no reliable recordings of the conversation, no interviews where Cash spoke openly about it. But crew members who were there that night, roadies, sound engineers, people whose names never made it into the official story, have shared fragments over the years, usually late at night in bars or backstage at other shows. They say Cash was shaking. Not angry shaking, but something deeper, something that looked like grief. June stayed close to him, and Marshall Grant reportedly asked what was wrong, but Cash didn't answer right away. He sat down on a road case, put his head in his hands, and stayed like that for maybe 2 minutes. Then he stood up, looked at the band, and said, "We finished the show." No explanation. No discussion. Just that. And they did. He walked back on stage, picked up where he left off, and played the rest of the set like nothing had happened. But people who were there said the energy was different. The warmth was gone. He sang the songs, hit the notes, smiled when appropriate, but there was a distance now, a wall between him and the audience that hadn't been there before. And when the show ended, he didn't linger. No long goodbyes, no encores. He left the building quickly, and the band packed up in record time. By the time most of the crowd had made it to their cars, the tour bus was already gone. So what was the symbol? That's the question that haunts this story, the detail that turns a strange moment into an actual mystery. No photographs of it are known to exist, at least not publicly. No journalists reported on it. The local newspapers covered the show, but only in the most generic terms. Johnny Cash delights mobile audience. That sort of thing. If the incident was mentioned at all, it was buried. But people talk. And over the years, a few descriptions have surfaced. Some say it was a cross, but not a standard Christian cross, something tilted, or inverted, or wrapped in a circle. Others recall it looking more like a runic symbol, the kind associated with old European paganism or, more disturbingly, with certain extremist groups that had adopted ancient imagery for their own purposes. A few witnesses described it as resembling a sunwheel, or a triskele, or something close to a swastika but not quite. The vagueness is frustrating, but it also makes sense. Symbols are slippery. They mean different things to different people, and in 1970, in the South, certain images carried weight that's hard to explain now. A simple shape could be a religious icon to one person and a threat to another. Context was everything. And whatever context Johnny Cash brought to that moment, it was enough to stop him cold. To understand why a symbol might shake a man like Johnny Cash, you have to understand who he was in 1970. This was not the young rebel who had stormed onto the scene in the 1950s, wild-eyed and hungry. This was a man who had been to hell and back, literally, in his own words. He'd battled addiction for years, survived car crashes, nearly died from an overdose in Nickajack Cave, and come out the other side with a faith that was both fierce and fragile. He'd married June Carter in 1968, and she had become his anchor, his conscience, his reason to stay clean. He was also, by this point, deeply aware of his platform. His television show gave him access to millions of homes every week, and he used it carefully, inviting guests who would never have appeared on mainstream TV otherwise. Pete Seeger, for instance, singing an anti-war song, or a Native American activist speaking about broken treaties. Cash had become a voice for people who didn't have one, and that made him dangerous to those who preferred the old order. There were rumors, never fully confirmed, that he'd received threats. Letters with no return address. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Some of his friends worried that his outspokenness would get him hurt, or worse. And in the South, in 1970, those fears weren't paranoid. People had been killed for less. Mobile itself had a history that can't be ignored. It was a city built on cotton and slavery, a place where fortunes were made on the backs of human suffering, and though the Civil War had ended a century earlier, the psychological architecture of that system hadn't fully collapsed. Reconstruction had failed. Jim Crow had replaced slavery with a different kind of bondage. And even after the Civil Rights Act, even after the marches and the speeches and the federal troops, there were still pockets of resistance, still people who believed the old way was the right way and that any challenge to it was an attack on their heritage, their identity, their God-given right to maintain a certain social order. Mobile was more cosmopolitan than some Alabama towns, but it wasn't immune. The Klan had chapters there. White citizens' councils met in respectable homes. And symbols mattered to these groups. They always had. The burning cross. The white robe. The hood. These were not just costumes, they were a language, a way of communicating power and fear without saying a word. And if you knew how to read that language, a single image could tell you everything you needed to know about who was in the room and what they wanted you to understand. Now imagine Johnny Cash, a man who had spent years trying to walk a fine line between his southern roots and his evolving conscience, standing on stage and seeing a symbol that connected to all of that. Imagine recognizing something that reminded him of violence, of hatred, of a world he thought, or hoped, was fading. Or maybe it wasn't even a symbol of hate. Maybe it was something else entirely, something personal, something tied to his own past in ways that no one else would understand. Cash grew up in Dyess, Arkansas, a farming community built during the Great Depression as part of a New Deal resettlement project. His family was poor, deeply Christian, and shaped by hardship. He'd seen racism up close. He'd seen men broken by poverty and pride. He'd also seen acts of kindness that defied logic, neighbors helping neighbors even when they had nothing to give. His worldview was complicated, stitched together from contradictions. And maybe the symbol he saw that night triggered a memory, a fear, a realization that cut too close to something he'd been trying to forget or forgive. The silence around this incident is as interesting as the incident itself. Why didn't Cash ever speak about it publicly? He was not a man who shied away from controversy. He sang about prisoners and Native Americans and the poor. He spoke openly about his drug addiction. He recorded an entire album protesting the treatment of indigenous people, even though it tanked commercially and his label hated it. So why not talk about Mobile? One possibility is that he was advised not to. Managers, publicists, label executives, they all had reasons to keep things quiet. Controversy could hurt ticket sales. It could alienate sponsors. And in 1970, with the country already fracturing over Vietnam, race, and generational conflict, adding fuel to that fire might have seemed unwise. Another possibility is that Cash himself didn't want to give the symbol, or the person holding it, any more power than it already had. Sometimes silence is a form of resistance. Refusing to name something, refusing to let it become part of the narrative, can be a way of denying it oxygen. Or maybe he was simply afraid. Not of physical harm, necessarily, but of what acknowledging the symbol would mean. Admitting that it bothered him would be admitting vulnerability, admitting that after everything he'd been through, something could still get to him. And for a man who built his image on strength and resilience, that might have been too much. There's another layer to consider. By 1970, Cash was not just a musician, he was a symbol himself. To his fans, he represented authenticity, rebellion, redemption. To his critics, he represented everything wrong with modern America, a man who had betrayed traditional values by embracing liberal causes. Both sides projected onto him what they needed to see. And in that context, any public incident involving a symbol could have been weaponized. The left might have used it to paint the South as irredeemably racist. The right might have used it to argue that Cash was exaggerating or playing the victim. The truth, whatever it was, would have been lost in the noise. And maybe Cash understood that. Maybe he knew that some stories don't have clean endings, that some moments resist explanation, and that trying to make sense of them publicly would only create more confusion. So he stayed quiet. He moved on. He kept touring, kept recording, kept living. But the people who were there that night never forgot. And over time, the story took on a life of its own, passed from person to person like an old ghost story, growing and changing with each retelling. The question of whether the man with the symbol intended to threaten Cash, or to send some other message, remains unanswered. It's possible he was part of a group, acting on behalf of people who wanted to intimidate Cash into silence. It's also possible he was acting alone, a lone individual with a grievance, or a belief that he felt compelled to express. Or maybe, and this is the strangest possibility, maybe he thought he was communicating something positive, something that Cash would understand and appreciate, and was completely unaware of how it would be received. Symbols are tricky that way. What looks like a threat to one person might look like a gesture of solidarity to another. And in a divided society, where people increasingly live in separate realities, those misunderstandings can have serious consequences. The fact that the man vanished into the crowd afterward suggests he knew what he was doing, though. He didn't stay to explain. He didn't wait to see if Cash would respond. He delivered his message and disappeared, which is exactly what someone would do if they wanted to provoke a reaction without facing consequences. Cash's behavior after that night also raises questions. He didn't cancel any shows. He didn't change his setlist. He didn't, as far as anyone knows, increase his security. He just kept going, which was very much in character. Cash believed in showing up, in doing the work, in not letting fear dictate his life. But those close to him noticed changes. He was quieter in the months that followed. He drank more coffee, smoked more cigarettes, spent more time alone on the bus between shows. June worried about him, but she'd always worried about him, so it was hard to say if this was different, or just more of the same. The band didn't talk about Mobile, at least not openly. There was an unspoken agreement that whatever had happened, it was staying in the past. And maybe that was for the best. Dragging it into the light might have made things worse. Or maybe it would have brought clarity. We'll never know. One detail that occasionally surfaces in retellings is the possibility that someone took a photograph of the symbol. Not an official press photo, but a personal snapshot, the kind taken with a cheap camera by someone in the audience. In the 1970s, people didn't document everything the way they do now. Cameras were expensive, film was limited, and most people went to concerts to experience them, not to record them. But there were always a few people with cameras, usually positioned near the front or in the balcony. If someone captured the moment, that photograph could still be out there, tucked into a shoebox in someone's attic, stuck in a scrapbook in a storage unit, or lost forever in a house fire or estate sale. Occasionally, someone on an online forum will claim they've seen it, or know someone who has, but these claims never produce results. The photo, if it exists, remains hidden. And maybe that's appropriate. Some things are meant to stay in the shadows, glimpsed but never fully revealed. The cultural context of 1970 can't be overstated. This was a year of violent contradictions. The Beatles broke up. 4 students were killed at Kent State. The Apollo 13 mission nearly ended in disaster. Charles Manson's trial dominated headlines. The country felt like it was tearing itself apart, and the music reflected that chaos. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young singing about tin soldiers and Nixon coming, the Stones singing about sympathy for the devil, Marvin Gaye asking what's going on. And into that maelstrom walked Johnny Cash, a man who seemed to belong to an earlier, simpler time but who refused to let that time define him. He was evolving, and not everyone was comfortable with that. Some fans wanted him to stay the outlaw, the rebel, the man in black who didn't care what anyone thought. Others wanted him to settle down, to become a wholesome family entertainer, to stop courting controversy. He was trying to do both, or maybe neither, and the strain was beginning to show. The Mobile incident, whatever it was, fit into that larger pattern of tension. It was another reminder that he couldn't please everyone, that every choice he made would be interpreted through a dozen different lenses, and that no matter what he did, someone would be angry. It's worth asking why this story matters. After all, thousands of strange things happen at concerts. Someone in the crowd does something odd, the performer reacts, and life goes on. But this felt different, and the people who were there sensed it. There was a weight to the moment that transcended the usual weirdness of live performance. Maybe it was the timing. 1970, the South, a man who had become a lightning rod for cultural conflict. Maybe it was the symbol itself, whatever it was, carrying meanings that we can only guess at now. Or maybe it was the look on Cash's face, the sudden vulnerability of a man who seemed indestructible. Whatever the reason, the moment stuck. It became one of those stories that gets told late at night, when the official histories have been exhausted and people start sharing the things that don't make it into the books. And those stories, the unofficial ones, are often the truest. They preserve the messy, unresolved, human parts of history that don't fit neatly into narratives. There's a theory, advanced by a few Cash scholars over the years, that the Mobile incident was connected to his work on behalf of Native Americans. By 1970, he had already recorded Bitter Tears, an album that told stories of indigenous suffering and resistance. The album had been commercially unsuccessful and critically divisive, but Cash considered it some of his most important work. He'd also been vocal about treaty violations, land theft, and the systemic destruction of native cultures. This made him enemies in certain circles, particularly among those who viewed any criticism of American expansion as unpatriotic. Some extremist groups at the time were deeply invested in myths of racial purity and manifest destiny, and they saw Cash's advocacy as a betrayal. The symbol, according to this theory, could have been a reference to one of those ideologies, a way of signaling that Cash was being watched, that his words had consequences. It's a plausible explanation, though impossible to prove. What we do know is that Cash received backlash for his activism, and that backlash sometimes took disturbing forms. Another angle involves his religious faith. Cash was a devout Christian, but his Christianity was complicated. He believed in grace, in redemption, in second chances. He also believed in justice, in standing up for the oppressed, in challenging hypocrisy. This put him at odds with certain strains of American Christianity that emphasized obedience, tradition, and the maintenance of social hierarchies. He'd been criticized by some religious leaders for his past drug use, for his association with rock and roll, for his willingness to question authority. And in the South, religion and politics were, and still are, deeply intertwined. A symbol that appeared religious on the surface could have carried political meaning underneath, or vice versa. Cash, with his deep knowledge of the Bible and his equally deep awareness of how Scripture could be twisted to justify cruelty, would have recognized that duality instantly. If the symbol he saw in Mobile played on those themes, it would explain why it hit him so hard. The passage of time has made the story harder to verify but also more intriguing. Most of the people who were in that auditorium are elderly now, or gone. Memories fade, details blur, and what seemed certain 50 years ago becomes uncertain. But that uncertainty is also what keeps the story alive. If we knew exactly what happened, if there was a clear explanation, the mystery would evaporate. Instead, we're left with fragments, with contradictions, with possibilities. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the value of this story isn't in solving it but in the questions it raises. What does it mean to see something that shakes you to your core in the middle of doing what you love? How do you keep going when the ground suddenly feels unstable? What do you do when you realize that no matter how much you've grown, there are still forces out there that want to drag you back, or break you, or silence you? These are the questions Cash had to live with, and they're questions we still face today. If you find yourself drawn to moments like this, where history brushes up against mystery and the personal becomes political, think about what it means to really listen. Not just to the songs, but to the silences between them. Not just to what's said, but to what's left unsaid. The full story of Mobile, Alabama, in January 1970, may never be known. But the fact that Johnny Cash stopped the band, that he saw something that made him freeze, that he walked off stage and had to gather himself before continuing, that tells us something important. It tells us that even the strongest among us have breaking points. It tells us that symbols have power. And it tells us that some wounds don't heal, they just get covered over, waiting for the wrong moment to reopen. Consider leaving a comment about where you're watching this from, and whether you remember a time when something you saw stopped you in your tracks. The stories we share are the only way we make sense of the past. And the past, as Cash knew better than most, is never really past. It's always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to remind us of who we were and who we still might become. The man with the symbol knew that. Johnny Cash knew that. And maybe, on some level, we all know it too,